Tuesday, more than 1,400 Israeli civilians were killed in those dreadful attacks that happened on October 7th. In response, Israel has launched a massive operation, first through airstrikes and over the last week or so, a limited ground operation. Israel's objective is very simple: to try and cut Hamas off its knees in a way that Hamas will not ever dare launch the kind of attacks that it did on October 7th. Is this achievable? How much of it has been achieved so far? And most importantly, at what cost? The rising civilian casualty toll is clearly acting as a pressure point on Israel from both the international community, from the United States, its biggest ally and benefactor, and of course, from neutral countries who have no skin in this game. Let me now go across to a very special guest who's joining us on this interview as we approach the first month anniversary of this war. Ambassador John Bolton is former national security advisor to the Trump administration. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bolton, for speaking with us. So Tuesday is going to be a month since the Israel Hamas war began. What is your assessment of where things stand as they stand today? Israel, in a sense, after October 7th, the entire world was outraged by what we saw. Israel was the victim, clearly. But in response, the way they've gone about with aerial strikes, with the ground operation, thousands of Palestinians dead, many of them happen to be children and women. Do you see time and options running out for Israel the longer this war drags on?
Well, it's hard to predict with certainty, but I think the most likely read here is that we're still in the very early stages of this conflict. And I think it's important to understand really what the full context of the conflict is. It's not a case of a Hamas war on Israel. I think these operations are directed, certainly approved by the mullahs in Tehran. I think this is a coalition effort against Israel involving Hamas in the first instance, but also Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Shia militia groups in Iraq, and obviously Iran itself. And the objectives, I think, are to impose as much harm on Israel as they can, and perhaps on the Gulf Arab states, and perhaps on the United States. But remember, everybody was taken by surprise by the Hamas attack. So it's very hard to read what Iran's overall strategy is. But I think it's in that larger context that people should evaluate what's happening in Gaza. There is no question but that Israel is entitled to exercise its inherent right of self-defense. And as long as it is targeting legitimate military objectives and it weighs the proportionality of the strike, the seriousness of the military target, compared to the risk of collateral damage, it is entitled under the law of war to proceed. I think what it's facing is a very well coordinated, actually quite sophisticated propaganda and disinformation campaign about exactly what's happening in Gaza. So I don't understate the pressure that's going to be brought on Israel, but I think after what they saw on October the 7th, they'll be perfectly resolved to resist it.
We're also seeing, and what this war has done in a sense, is it's deeply divided civil society. And we're seeing this nowhere more so than in the United States. We're seeing this in protests outside the US Congress. We're seeing this in campuses across America. This event has really split American society, and we haven't seen something like this since the Ukraine war. I would even go back all the way to the Vietnam War. How much elbow room do you believe the Biden administration has to back Israel to the hilt on this? So far they have, but we have seen Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Israel over the weekend. There's always this constant statements about, a humanitarian corridor and that Israel needs to follow the rules of war, etc. Is time running out in that sense? Time and options running out? At what point do these statements from US officials stop becoming statements and are requisite of more actions that Israel takes?
Well, you've identified a very important point here. This is a split within the United States, primarily in the Democratic Party, with the very left wing of the party opposing the Biden administration's policy. The bulk, the more traditional part of the Democratic Party, I think, still very supportive of Biden and of assistance to Israel. This split, unlike Ukraine, does not affect the Republican Party, which is as close to unanimous in support of Israel as you can get in contemporary American politics. And I think this split, which is to oversimplify somewhat, but this is basically a split within the left of the Western democracies. You see the same pattern in Europe, in England in particular, but really I think throughout Europe, and it does raise a risk for Israel that Biden support has already begun to weaken.
Okay.
There are a lot of tactical calls here, but I'm sure the Israelis can see what everybody else can see on television, and I'm sure they're taking it into account. Remember, one of the tenets of Israel's defense strategy since its independence in 1948 was that they had to be prepared on their own to defend Israel. They had seen what happened during the Holocaust and World War II. They didn't ever want to be dependent on anybody else again. They're certainly prepared to receive assistance, and in the case of the United States, we're certainly prepared to deliver it. But fundamentally, I think Israel knows that at some point it's going to have to continue on its own. And I just believe from all that I've heard from inside Israel and in the United States, they are very serious when they say their objective is to eliminate Hamas as a political and military force. And if they follow through on that in what could be a long struggle, they know they may have to finish it alone.
I do want to get a word from you also on the stand that has been taken by India, both in the context of this current conflict. I think Prime Minister Modi was one of the first world leaders to come out and pretty unequivocally condemn the Hamas terror attacks. What are your thoughts on the stand that India has taken, not just in this war, but also, in the previous Russia-Ukraine war, where India's stand was slightly nuanced, slightly different, keeping, of course, its own self-interest in mind. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, it's obviously something of considerable importance to the United States, and I think it reflects India's growing significance on the international stage. I wish the position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine was more supportive of Ukraine. I understand the circumstances. I think what we need to talk, certainly between the United States and India, about is how to make India less dependent on Russian weapon systems, Russian oil and gas. I think we're seeing a new axis forming in the world, a Chinese-Russian axis. That obviously has enormous implications for India, and I think that in part is what's playing out in Ukraine. Now, in the Middle East, nobody needs to tell people in India what the risk of radical terrorist attacks can be. And so I think solidarity with Israel there comes from understanding the nature of the threat that Israel is facing. But I also think this plays into the larger geostrategic picture. A few days ago, Russian Prime Minister Medvedev said that Israel did not have a right to self-defense because it was an occupying power in Gaza and the West Bank. That happens not to be true, but it was an interesting statement. We've also seen reports in the press that the Wagner Group is assisting bringing air defense systems to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I will guarantee that Wagner Group doesn't take a step without Vladimir Putin's approval. There are other signs as well, but it may well be that in its growing closeness to Iran for the war in Ukraine, the Iranian drones they're using, Russia's also, in effect, switching sides in the Middle East. Because of the extensive Jewish emigration from Russia, there had actually been pretty good Moscow-Jerusalem relations. I think that may be shifting. That would be a very historic shift, and I think that's something we're all going to have to take a close look at.
All right, Ambassador John Bolton, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your thoughts on this 1 month anniversary, if you will, since the beginning of this war between Israel and Hamas. So what is going on?